Konami's had its ups and downs over the years. For every Metal Gear Solid, there's a Survive. For every Symphony of the Night,
what is a man? Konami!
There's Judgment. And for every Contra, there's a Rogue Core. But there was a time where Konami was hitting the target more than missing with its internally developed roster of titles, particularly during the PlayStation era. We already mentioned MGS and Castlevania, but there was Silent Hill, Suikoden, the Pro Evo series, Vandal Hearts, Azure Dreams, games that span genres made in-house at Konami. Having found success in cinematic action stealth games, action role-playing games, traditional RPGs, sports games, horror games, tactics, who's to say they couldn't take a swing at another genre, specifically the massive fighting game genre. While home consoles had for a while allowed fans to recreate the fun of the arcade in their home, the PlayStation provided even more possibilities. Now, the ability to make a close enough approximation of the big arcade brawlers in your living room helped take the genre to new heights. The SNES obviously had influential and popular games: Street Fighter II and Alpha, Fatal Fury, Mortal Kombat, Samurai Showdown. They could all squeeze onto a cartridge. Street Fighter II, released in '91 in the arcade, was the first snowball rolling down the mountainside. Mortal Kombat came along next. Both rightly were phenomenal. Many imitators followed. The problem was, they were pretty much 2D fighters, all nuances aside. Then came Virtua Fighter in '93, followed by Tekken a year later. In arcade land, while Virtua Fighter had helped cement 3D fighters as a tandem evolution of the genre, you couldn't play it at home unless you had a Saturn, and not many people had a Saturn. What they were buying was the PlayStation.
The Sony PlayStation. Now see the outstanding technical capabilities of Sony's advanced video game system.
They had Battle Arena Toshinden, Tobal, Soul Edge, Bloody Roar, DOA, and I'd argue the most important, Tekken. You could play Tekken in the arcade, or you could stick the disc in the console at home. Brawlers were big business, but their market saturation was relatively shallow. For some perspective, on Wikipedia's list of the best-selling video games, out of the 125 games listed, 6 are fighting games. They're the Tekken, Street Fighter, and MK series. Combined, they sold more than 18.5 million units. Tekken 3 sold over 8 million copies during its time, and the first game, 1.7 million. Turning to the arcade scene, it's a similar story. Street Fighter II dominates in '91 and '92 in the arcades. SF2 Turbo's released in '93, but you've also got Garo Densetsu 2, Aratanaru Tatakai, Fatal Fury 2, as well as Samurai Showdown. '94 sees even more with a new Street Fighter release: Virtua Fighter, Garo Densetsu Special, Fatal Fury Special, Vampire: The Night Warriors, which most people know as Darkstalkers, and King of Fighters '94. It's only in '95 that Street Fighter's crown is finally snatched away, by which game? Virtua Fighter 2. During this year, in Japan, 9 out of 10 of the highest grossing arcade games were fighters. So let's take a look at the console market for a sec. From around '91 to '95, using a dataset on video game sales, 70 fighting games had cumulatively sold over 47.5 million units across available hardware. Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, Virtua Fighter, Tekken, and Killer Instinct dominate that list. Konami makes an appearance way down at the bottom with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Tournament Fighter on NES and SNES. Individually, they don't crack 1 million unit sales. So you can imagine a company like Konami looking at the current landscape and thinking, damn, maybe we should get back in on that. It's been years since Ya Kung Fu left its mark on the scene. Aside from a sequel that didn't move the needle, Konami hadn't seriously internally developed fighters. Maybe now, in the early 90s, was the time they got back in the ring.
Here comes a new challenger!
Whether it was at the arcade or at home, the early to mid-90s showed you that having a fighting game had the potential to be extremely profitable. Problem was, it needed to be an excellent fighting game. Lightning Legend Daigo no Daibouken, or Lightning Legend Daigo's Big Adventure, released exclusively in Japan and on the PlayStation in 1996, perhaps seeing the growing influence of the 3D fighter in Tekken and Virtua Fighter, they viewed polygonal fighters as the future. Lightning Legend, though technically a 3D fighter, plays more akin to a traditional 2D fighter. Think Street Fighter and Fatal Fury. Its colourful, anime-inspired presentation and diverse cast at the very least makes the game visually appealing. But did it manage to become this smash 3D-2D hybrid which would evolve the genre like YA had done over a decade ago? Well, of course not. During the game's opening cutscene, you'll meet Girigiri Oyaji. He's your compere, delivering exposition on why you'll be travelling a facsimile of Japan and bashing buttons. The general premise for Lightning Legend is that 450 years ago, the Demon King Dragless appeared and attempted to rule the world. However, thanks to a brave warrior, he was defeated and sealed within the depths of the earth. Now, however, Dragless has reappeared, and while they may not realize it, each fighter will ultimately find their paths crossing. You're then treated to a banger of an opening song, along with some animation that would put the most recent season of Blue Lock to shame. Once you've finished listening to Nagasawa Yurike's Shinkiro, you'll soon discover that Lightning Legend breaks the mold from traditional fighters in a few quirky ways. Firstly is the presentation. The character select screen is just a room where everyone's chilling. Every time you highlight a player, they'll give you the old side eye as if you just accidentally wandered into the room. Of the 8 characters is of course the titular Daigo, but after you've chosen your first character, you then have the opportunity to select your first opponent. It's a novel element which ties into the game's very light RPG mechanics. Depending on who you choose, you'll then travel through their particular story. In Daigo's case, we can translate it straightly as the legendary hero's blood. Oh yeah, the game was only released in Japan, so it's obviously all in Japanese, except when it's not, like the menus. So Daigo, believing he has the blood of the legendary hero who once defeated Dragless running through his veins, sets off to defeat the monster once again. His dad would rather he not, but he's not going to stand in his way. You're then treated to another cutscene involving your main character's meeting with whomever you chose to battle against. Defeating each opponent in your way then allows you to traverse the map, kinda like Street Fighter 2. Instead of a little plane, which I assume ferries your fighters to their destination, your protagonist will hoof it across Japan. Each interaction before and after the battle with your opponent will be relatively unique depending on your chosen fighter. Several battles later, you'll come face to face with Dragless. Think Ogre from Tekken 3, even has the breath attack similar to Devil from Tekken 2. In the closing cutscene, Adolf, another warrior, congratulates you on bringing peace to the world. You'll then have another cutscene specific to that character. And that's how the game's story mode plays out. In completing the story mode with different characters, you can unlock treasures. While there are character-specific items, you really want the treasure box and the treasure box key. That'll unlock the collection mode, but more about that later. We need to talk about the Moku Moku in the room. If you played Street Fighter, King of Fighters, or any 2D fighter of that ilk, you'll find Lightning Legend a poor imitator. It adopts the control scheme of light, medium, and heavy attacks, along with a taunt button. Each character has a limited number of combo chains they can execute, sometimes switching between different attacks, but it's all pretty simple. One interesting point is that your super meter doesn't charge through attacks, but through holding 2 buttons. If you played Dragon Ball Z Super Budoten, or basically any Dragon Ball game, it's similar. You can perform special moves through familiar button flows, as well as pull off a super when your meter's full. On top of that, if the game allows it, you can combo into special moves. Players can also dash back and forwards, as well as block by holding back, so it's mostly standard. Now, I'm no expert, but that's never stopped anyone from giving their opinion before. There's just this jankiness to the fighting, particularly in the character models. Some moves simply outright miss depending on the opponent you're facing. I have no idea if this was intended. A part of me feels like it adds some interesting matchups to the game, but you could just be like Oddjob in GoldenEye. Like, the meta for this game would be choosing Naughty Now, because attacking the mushroom-headed child is like trying to catch a fly with chopsticks, or the giant stuffed animal Moku Moku, which nothing seems to hit. Some attacking moves are simply unusable. It has to be intentional, right? Another issue is characters feel a little too homogenized. Daigo, Yuki, Adolf, Rankuk, they all have pretty similar fireball attacks. I understand the notion of wanting to provide players with a spacing tool. There's just more inventive ways to pull that off. And speaking of general movesets for characters, Lightning Legend goes out of its way to directly lift, or shall we say pay homage, to moves from other titles. Sure, no one owns the fireball, or Chun-Li's lightning kicks, or the Rising Dragon Punch, or Terry Bogard's Buster Wolf, or Ryu's Hurricane Kick, but what's Lightning Legend bringing to the table? Kicking a child in the face? Actually, jiggle physics.
It's like one of my Japanese animes.
Funny thing is, this isn't mentioned on the English wiki entry for the game, just the Japanese. It's called Chichi-yure. Chichi is the chest and yureru is to sway. Did you know there's actually a Wikipedia article dedicated to breast physics? So yeah, there's jiggling in the game. Okay, so where were we? Super moves, special moves, normal moves. They have a habit of missing against a number of characters. In the battle against Dragless, I can kind of accept it because it's a gimmick fight. That's not to say that characters aren't fun to play. In particular, Daigo, Mayu and Misa were probably my favourites. Mayu specifically because she had Buster Wolf and Rising Dragon Punch. Misa because of her balletic moveset. Daigo's just an all-round solid character. Okay, to step back from the brawling and examine the game's presentation, the polished 3D graphics are admittedly nice. They're Lightning Legend's strongest point. Sure, characters like Rankuk and Adolf, man, the game has some interesting names, take inspiration from Dragon Ball Z or Super Sentai, but I'd give Daigo's fit a go. The in-game stages, while simple planes attempt to evoke different locales from around Japan, the game's more successful in its chibi RPG sections, where you can clearly see the places meant to be Tokyo or around Hokkaido or Kyoto. Finally, the game does have a few extra modes, but is missing a training mode, which is pretty unforgivable. You've got versus mode, of course, time attack mode is pretty self-explanatory. Collection mode, however, is rather unique and expansive. The conceit of the mode is simple, you just battle. If you fulfill certain conditions, win a round with a perfect, use a special technique, things like that, you'll be rewarded with one of the collection items. In doing so, you can unlock new characters, stages, and costumes for the roster. Don't get me wrong, it's an interesting conceit, you just need a better game to hang it on. I've been dunking on Lightning Legend quite a bit. Making a game is hard. Making any kind of art is a constant struggle. The fact that anything is released is nothing short of a miracle, but it's worth looking at the team who created the game. Ishikawa Hirotaka served as the game's director and main programmer. Before Lightning Legend, Ishikawa had worked in a programming capacity on the Run and Gun Aliens in 1990 and The Simpsons in 91. Both games, though the latter more so, received a positive reception. If you were at an arcade in the 90s, then of course you've played The Simpsons game, come on. But those two games weren't fighting games. We can definitely say The Simpsons as a beat-em-up is fighting game adjacent, but it's not quite the same. Okay, so who else have we got? Takahashi Masanaka had previously worked on the Genesis/Mega Drive version of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Tournament Fighters. This was a 2D fighter. Now, there were three versions of the game, NES, SNES, and Genesis. The Genesis version received the lowest critical reception. This isn't a slight on Takahashi, it's just what critics thought. Hashimoto Kazuhisa, one of the game's producers, had no previous fighting game experience, and it's the same story with Kitao Gozo, the other producer. Firstly, I don't want to insinuate that if you don't have certain game experience on your CV, that you can't create a game in a certain genre. That is absolutely not true. I've seen people with no on-paper experience kill it, but I've also seen the opposite. Secondly, I'm singling out these people because I would assume as producers, a director, and main programmer, they have the greatest say on shaping the game. On the surface, without obviously knowing everything, there's no one with strict fighting game experience. We can assume that Takahashi has some. Is it possible this assumed lack of direct experience contributed to what is not necessarily a great fighting game, but a kind of competent experience at the very least? Maybe the team would have a better chance with their next endeavor. While this was arguably Konami's second round in the fighting genre, Fighting Wushu or Fighting Bujutsu was an arcade exclusive game developed in-house at Konami, though by a different team. Try as I might, while I could get this game to technically work on MAME, it ran like ass, which made evaluating it impossible. Unlike Lightning Legend, this did see a Western release, albeit in the arcade like its Japanese counterpart. It also had a sequel, though more like an upgrade, released several months later. There's a really cool pamphlet on Hiroyuki Maeda's Japanese journalist's website. One is a double-page spread extolling the virtues of the game, basically an essay justifying why you'd want to feed this thing coins like a hungry duck. The other showcases the actual cabinets that would sit in the arcade. There's the smaller 29-inch cabinet that you'll normally find lined up beside each other with other games and the like. The other is your Big Daddy centerpiece rocking up at 50 inches. When I was a kid, there was a corner shop which had a large 50-inch style cabinet for Tekken 3. That thing was sick. Rather than Lightning Legend's 2D inspired battles, Fighting Bujutsu takes its cues from Virtua Fighter, Punch, Kick, and Guard. There are a total of 8 characters available in the roster, each boasting different fighting styles. The majority of the footage is coming from the YouTube channel Fighting Games Esoterica. Even that's being sped up so as not to run at a glacial pace. As of right now, getting it to work is very much a work in progress. In Sega Saturn magazine number 23 is a pretty complimentary article towards the game. Quote, "Each character has their own distinctive personality and unique fighting style that is reproduced with unbelievable realism." End quote. The article also notes the mocap movements and adaptable AI, with the claim that Fighting Wushu could be a Virtua Fighter 3 beta. Only time will tell. There is actually clear footage. The game itself appears to play much like Virtua Fighter. Combat is quick and the frame rate's snappy. You've got your aerial combos, specials, unblockable moves, and 3D movement. On the surface, I'd much rather get to grips with Fighting Bujutsu than Lightning Legend, so why aren't we queuing up in an online lobby to play Fighting Bujutsu 13 Hyper Fighting in the current year of our Lord? Interestingly, Hiroyuki says that despite Konami really pushing the game, with only 8 characters and a lack of high enough aerial combos, the game was rather unappealing. Translation is mine, but the gist seems to be that while you can launch your opponent, perhaps it was not far enough to what people were used to from other games. The launchers part I can agree with. First thing I do in a lot of newer fighting games is get into training mode, experimenting with how to get characters in the air and keep them there. These days, I think the meta, especially in games like Tekken, has been so narrowed down, people feel like they can't experiment anymore. It may be the nostalgia talking, but playing Tekken 5 or DOA with friends and discovering all the new aerial combos they'd figured out was a blast. However, as for Fighting Bujutsu, honestly, the launchers look fine to me. More than anything though, it's a graphically impressive game, and move execution does look nice. It is decidedly mid-looking, but it lacks a certain character. Just look at what it was competing with at the time for visual flair. Tekken, Street Fighter, Virtua Fighter, Mortal Kombat, and more. They knew the selling point was the characters in addition to the gameplay. One of the mistakes Fighting Bujutsu may be guilty of is deliberately hanging its hat on realism and authenticity. I mean, you're about to hit the club. Who do you want to be, a wingman, wing lady, or wing person? This dude? Or this dude? Finding information on Fighting Bujutsu was quite a trying task. There is little out there, very few articles, no direct information on who worked on the game. Given the push Konami originally gave it, there's surely an interesting story behind its execution. Perhaps the world's just not ready for that story to be told, which isn't what we can say about Konami's next title. Chronologically, one of the best kinds of logic sees Battle Tryst as Konami's third 3D fighter. Battle Tryst, released in February of 1998, returns to the Virtua Fighter 3-button layout, but covers it in a much more colourful coat of paint. Gone is the harder, more realistic presentation. In comes the 90s anime aesthetic. Imagine you're in the arcade in the late 90s. You've got a Tamagotchi in one hand and a bunch of change in the other. You see the Battle Tryst poster. Your eyes are drawn to the woman in the red dress. Then to the tagline. Will you win prize? Money or fame? It's no you winner, but it's close. The Japanese is Tenitsuru no wa shokin ka mirai ka, which we can roughly translate to the much more badass, what are you fighting for? A fortune or the future? Incidentally, Mirai is the distant future, even beyond life itself in some contexts, which is a much cooler question than fame. But yeah, streets ahead of fighting Bujutsu, peak anime. As you advance through the stages, you're awarded that bag. The final 3 digits of your prize money determine the final stage boss that you will go against, which is quite novel. Beyond the anime aesthetics and 3-button layout, another interesting feature of Battle Tryst is its approach to introducing new characters in the roster. Over a month or so, new fighters were released in an attempt to give the game a longer shelf life, and the fighters this time caught your eye much more than fighting Bujutsu. Mamoru Oshii, who many will know as being the director of Ghost in the Shell and Battle Aboard 2, came aboard to direct the game's opening and its characters' endings. Characters themselves were designed by Shujiro Hamakawa, who would move on from Konami in '98 to go to the animation industry. Aside from the ridiculous names, Bytes, Macintosh and Gary Williams, the latter of which sounds like he works in an office doing accounting work, they've got visual flair when compared to fighting Bujutsu, at least. Kika's red jumpsuit definitely draws the eye. Najid reminds me of Pullum from Street Fighter EX. Bytes has that Brian Fury vibe. Takeru looks like Ryu's cousin. Still, they're lagging behind in that drip factor to what came before them and what was available at the time. The shift to 3D was still relatively in its infancy. Transferring that eye-catching quality you had with sprites to polygons was difficult. No one really had it nailed down, well, except Tekken, Soul Edge, rival schools, the list goes on. Graphically, compared to what was both in the arcades and on console, Battle Tryst still leaves a bit to be desired. Maybe a fair comparison in its presentation would be Arika's Street Fighter EX Plus Alpha, but as soon as you look at the fact that it was released in '96 and just how much snappier it plays, it's easy to see that gulf. Also, EX Plus Alpha has one of the best fighting game soundtracks ever composed, do not at me on that. Interestingly, there was also a first-person mode accessible in the game, which was also in both Tekken 2 and Virtua Fighter 3. Obviously, without being able to play the game, I can't pass judgment on how it actually plays, but I can sure make some assumptions. It reminds me a little of the Tobal series in the way characters attack, a lot snappier than Lightning Legend. It kind of looks a little too simplistic. Fighting Bujutsu appeared to be a better game on the surface, though that may be a pretty ignorant take. The game's director Shujiro Hamakawa, while having worked on arcade titles before, doesn't appear to have any direct fighting game experience as far as Moby Games is concerned anyway. The closest in terms of experience was 1989's beat-em-up Crime Fighters and Gaiopolis in 1993. Many of the designers on the title, while having worked on various Konami games, hadn't touched anything in the fighting genre. Not saying that to throw shade, it just appears to be the reality. The fact that we don't hear about Battle Tryst to this day, not to mention finding info on the game, was a huge pain. It's safe to say it did not have an enduring legacy. The most standout aspect of it is the cutscenes, which were punching well above the weight of the game itself. So, could Konami's next stab at the genre be the one that brought them up to par with giants like Capcom and Namco? Deadly Arts, or as it was known in Europe, GASP Fighters Next Dream, or as it was known in Japan, GASP Fighters Next Dream, generation of arts, speed and power, was a bunch of ones and zeros that through manipulation of the dark arts became a game. It was an N64 exclusive, released in '98, and would arguably be the penultimate fully 3D fighter released by Konami. Now, the N64 not only lacked fighting games, but good fighting games, Smash Bros and Killer Instinct aside. It did receive a number of bad games though. I'd include GASP in that list, but there was one fan, Consoles Plus, or because it was a French magazine, Console Plus. If we used to think that dedicated console mags bumped up their score a little, or if we meme on no game getting below a 7 in recent years, this review was ahead of the curve. Consoles Plus gave GASP an 81%. Everyone is entitled to their opinion, but that is an incorrect one. Now, I tried playing this game, I decided to give it a shot, but after spending around half an hour with it, I just couldn't bring myself to waste any more time. Bland movesets, janky controls, uninspired characters, it's baffling. You just look at the quality released around the time, admittedly on other platforms, and you wonder why. Out of all the 3D fighters in this list, it is, without a doubt, the worst. Its review in Electronic Gaming Monthly issue 111 garnered an average of 1.5. and the reviewer's comments probably sum it up best. Quote, "It is probably one of the top 5 worst fighting games I've ever played. The kicky punchy genre has hit a new low with Deadly Arts." End quote. In situations like this, I can't figure out if it would have taken more courage to look at the game as it was going through development and say, you know what, this is a miss, let's shelve it. Or it's a sunk cost fallacy, where you truly believe it will come together once it reaches alpha or some nebulous point beyond. This is a game where during pre-production they looked at it and what was around at the time and were fine with how it was developing. It is honestly baffling. It gives me retro frustration. I wanted to see just what Famitsu had to say about the game, but the actual content of the review is no longer with us or was simply ported from the magazine. All that remains now is a slightly broken page with like 100 question marks, which I feel sums up the game where words might fail. I take umbrage with Nintendo Power's review too. Overall, it's sitting at a 6.8. I mean, come on, Scott. Game design gets a 7, satisfaction a 6.5. Was his family being held hostage while he wrote this review? It mentioned the custom character creator, which is a novel idea and was cool in Street Fighter EX plus Alpha 3, but it's still not enough to elevate Deadly Arts. The best thing I could say about the game from my admittedly limited time with it is that it is functional. As a product, it works. If you believe in multiverse theory, in some reality, Deadly Arts is a Tekken and Street Fighter killer. In this universe, it's just a bland, boring game. So let's move on. Let's end with Konami's best showing in the 3D fighting arena, Kensei Sacred Fist, known in Japan as Buggy. Without a doubt, this is Konami's best stab at a 3D fighter. Whereas previous entries took their cues from Street Fighter or Virtua Fighter, this time around Tekken's the template. It's clear from the character designs, brawling archetypes, and the moment-to-moment gameplay that the King of Iron Fist left an indelible imprint. By the time of the game's Winter 98 release, Tekken 3 had been out since March of that year on home console. More than a year had passed since it had been gobbling up yen in Japanese arcade cabinets. It's difficult to state how much of a shift in 3D fighters happened with not just Tekken 2 to 3, but the 3D fighting scene in general. Arguably, nothing had played as well as Tekken 3. It was this tight, arcadey experience with cool moves, characters, and combos. It became the game to beat, spawning countless imitators. To this day, what 3D fighter comes close? The only other game series I'd say gave Tekken a run for its money, despite the critical acclaim of Virtua Fighter 4, was the Dead or Alive series. DOA took what Tekken did and shifted it up a gear. It boasted more insane juggling before Tekken, it played quicker, its counter system added another dimension of gameplay. There was a time you could utter the two in the same breath, and the first DOA game had hit the arcade in 96. You could pick it up on the Saturn in Japan in 97. If you had a PlayStation, you'd have been waiting until 98. But we're on Kensei here. So what I'm saying is there were quality 3D fighters out there. Bloody Roar had been unleashed the previous year too, much to the delight of the furries. So what lesson has Kensei learned from within Konami and from the landscape at the time? Well, the game would see a number of alumni from Lightning Legend. Ishikawa Hirotaka would take the reins as director, Takahashi Masanaka too as the lead programmer. Had Lightning Legend performed so well that Konami was champing at the bit to pump out another fighter from the same team? For some perspective, the research I'd been referencing claimed that Kensei shifted around 200,000 units globally. That got more press. Considering Lightning Legend was Japan only, we can assume it sold well below that. When faced with a tepid critical response and potential low sales, it's easy to take the loss. Konami at least deserves props for giving the team another bite at the cherry. It shows. Kensei is clearly a step up, not only from Lightning Legend, but its predecessors. Inspiration still comes from Virtua Fighter, punch, kick, guard, throw, nothing new. But some of DOA's DNA has snuck in there. You can execute a variety of combos, unleash aerial mix-up, punish players on the ground and casually trample over them. A few characters have a dedicated counter move, which is OP. However, while every character can block, one of Kensei's most interesting mechanics is its parry execution. Slightly similar to DOA, Parrying sees your character perform a series of dodges and hops to avoid your foe throwing hands. It looks sick. It's such a simple element, but I wish more games did it. In Kensei, parrying gives you that little bit more reaction time to getting hits while the opponent is attacking. It doesn't have the passiveness of blocking, which is a skill in itself. There's agency though. Parrying allows you to interrupt the other person's attack string. Sure, the risk isn't there, which you'll find in DOA, but even Tekken 3 only had a parry with a few characters. It's something. One of the most frustrating aspects of Kensei is its overall responsiveness in battle. Particularly, sidestepping feels all but useless because after executing the evade, there's a gulf in when it allows you to attack. By the time you can attack or grab, you've wasted any opening. It seems the game would rather you utilize a specific sidestep attack, which, while fine I guess, restricts any expressiveness. Let's take a look at the character roster. You start with a total of 9 selectable characters, not bad. Unlike Konami's previous foray into fighting games, these characters all look a hell of a lot more visually appealing and mostly distinguish themselves in their movesets. However, some get a little more love than others, and it shows. While the game may boast to have more than double that initial roster, it's a lie, kinda. The characters that you unlock, the majority via completing story mode, are simply model swaps. Take Yugo, for example. His model swap is his brother Akira. 90% of their move lists are the same, with only slight variations which don't do enough to distinguish them honestly. I'd say the true number of unique fighters is around 11. Basically, the top portion of the character select screen, which is mid as fuck, by the way. That's not to say the roster of brawlers lack appeal. When I see a character in Kensei, it's like the devs went, we need that archetype. Take for instance the poster boy, Sanguji Yugo. This guy is your Mishima clone, with him swinging towards Kazuya. This is in part thanks to his visual design, mainly the white gi, karate pants, plus the hand and foot guards. Beyond this is Yugo's fighting style, a form of karate. Now, of course, we can't claim that series can have a monopoly on combat arts, that'd be ludicrous, but Yugo's moves list does evoke the Mishima's particular brand of karate, more so than Akira from Virtua Fighter. As a character, he's definitely one of, if not the, most solid. Great attack strings, launchers, good mix-up, and his counter is super powerful, he's S tier. There are characters that prioritize speed, such as Alan. His Muay Thai is strongly reminiscent of Zack from DOA, not to mention his model swap is basically Tiger from Tekken 3. Alan reminds me of Billy Idol or some reanimated zombie punk. Saya Tsubaki is your Ling Xiaoyu, wearing some crazy skimpy outfits. You'll recognize her Kempo style and multiple stances. She's also the daughter of the big bad Kaya Tsubaki. Hongyu Lee is an interesting character in that her moveset is completely dedicated to Drunken Fist Kung Fu. If you've seen Brad Wong from DOA, some of Leia's moves from Tekken 2 onwards, or Shun-Di from Virtua Fighter 2, you know the character you're getting into. Anne Griffith is perhaps one of the weakest characters in the game in terms of moves and overall viability. She feels like a we have Nina at home kind of character, or a lesser Tina from DOA. I think in theory she was meant to evoke a Sarah Bryant. Heinz Strait is another solid character with an MMA kind of moveset. Not particularly quick, but he has some decent combos and can output damage, think Paul Phoenix. Hyumo Tsukikage is one of the game's most interesting characters because of his diverse acrobatic move list, making him a tough opponent to face. He's your Kage or Hayabusa clone. Definitely a character along with Yugo who clearly got more love and attention during development. David Human, what a ridiculous name, is your token grappler. Never gravitated towards these players in fighting games with the exception of King. I just find him slow. Like min-maxing a barbarian, he lacks charisma. You've got no riz, Mark Human. Cho Le-Meng, aside from having a terrifying Junji Ito-inspired character portrait, is mostly a joke character, kind of like Gon, but Gon was actually fun to play. This guy with his cigar perpetually in hand reminds me of that scene in The Simpsons where Lisa is kicking the air every time Bart comes towards her. Douglas Anderson. How Kensei did not get sued for this guy is beyond me. It's not just his character portrait that apes Seagal. Of course, his moveset does it as well. The hand gestures while he's in battle are hilarious. Unlike Seagal, who rarely included kicks in his arsenal, Douglas does have a few that are surprisingly effective. Not a particularly solid character, but he's kind of fun to dunk on and imagine it's Steve getting laid out. Finally, you've got Kaya Tsubaki. Really powerful, good moveset. If you've been playing with characters like Saya, then you can get to grips with him fairly quickly. However, his unblockable, where he screams and then proceeds to claw at your face like two drunk women fighting outside a bar, is always entertaining. Final shout out goes to the parrot and penguin characters. Why are they here? Only God or the devs know. They have Alan's moveset and are nothing more than novelty characters. It's kind of fun to have them duke it out in the watch mode though. There's enough variety in the lineup, excluding the model swaps, that make the roster a huge improvement over something like Lightning Legend. The former is different in its mechanics and intention, sure, but in terms of Konami's output, regardless of those working on the team, this is the best. Whether Kensei owes that to the team maturing, understanding the genre more, and having ample time to digest the fighting landscape, who knows? It's probably all three. Much like its predecessors, you'll find yourself progressing through the story mode to unlock new characters, but there is also time attack, training, and survival, as well as the extra mode. We'll get to that. You'll mostly be fighting against the CPU, which can be hit and miss. It has some quirks. It likes to block a lot. This often seems to depend on the character you're facing. Perhaps it was just my style, but I often encountered strange difficulty spikes against the CPU, regardless of the difficulty. Even when playing on expert mode, I rarely felt any tangible difference in what I was up against. I'm not exactly a top tier player. It can be cheesed quite easily as well. You see, the CPU loves to attack on wake up, rising from the ground. What this does is leave an open window for you to bait the attack, back off, and then get hit. The CPU never learns from this. You can cheese the entire game. Counters are also broken because you can easily bait out an attack from an opponent. Along with this, there are also a number of moves, particularly grabs, which will easily wipe out 50% of your health. Fighting the CPU is fine. It just doesn't offer the kind of high level challenge you'll find in the likes of Tekken or DOA. Pick something. Obviously, once you reach a certain level of skill in any game, you can trivialize CPU encounters. I just didn't expect it to happen this quickly. Reviewers at the time were largely unimpressed. Outside of Wikipedia, it's extremely difficult, nigh on impossible, to find any kind of marketing or general consensus on the game. One of the interesting elements of dumpster diving in the Internet Archive for various game mags is that the reviews at the time were also short. Anyway, GameSpot gave Kensei a 4.7. Of the game, James Milk had similar hang-ups. The number of moves available is also fairly limited, and they seem to be uncomfortably familiar to other fighting game signature moves. Furthermore, the characters themselves seem kind of cookie-cutter with uninspired character design. The biggest problem, regretfully, is the sluggish response time. The GamePro review, which Wikipedia says is issue 214 but it's actually 125, has a pretty curt review from Boba Fett. Combatants move fluidly and feel real, but the action is slower paced than Tekken 3's, and many of the controls seem sluggish at times. I did try to see what the Japanese press had to say about the game, but aside from the occasional blog and Japanese magazine archiving being way behind the West, finding an official review of the game was impossible. Something tells me they wouldn't have harbored a much different opinion anyway. One final peculiar facet of Kensei is the extra mode. In the mode, the characters from the game are transported into a void where they must race around a floating track. There are multiple tracks to choose from. Each character has unique stats as well. Why is it here? Why are we here? I don't know. What I assume is that Konami probably had a racing game lying about that was created in the same engine as Kensei, so they could essentially package it and drop it in a game for a laugh. There is something surreal about watching a character hurtle through a black hole. Then you realize you're controlling them. Then you wonder why you're doing it. It's quite avant-garde. Maybe the devs saw Tekken bowling and thought they needed some analog of it. It leaves me with more questions than answers, which kind of sums up my thoughts on not just Kensei but Konami's foray into the fighting game genre as a whole. They came the closest to a competent game with Kensei. Even then, compared to the quality on offer at the time, it ends up being nothing more than a pale imitation of the greats. Konami's attempts were a lesser whatever's hot at the time. The company clearly had a stable of talent. Their heyday was the 90s. However, on the surface, internally, there was never that one person or team with the qualities required to muscle in alongside the heavyweights. Should Konami have done what Namco did with Tekken, in poaching proven talent from another studio, like what happened with Ishiseichi? Honestly, yeah. From the timeline, it looks like Konami bet big with fighting Bujutsu, market campaign and all, but it didn't pay off. The game was a dud. It wasn't up to snuff with its opponents at the time. Then, quietly over the years, other relatively small teams tried to crack the genre with limited success every time. Did Kensei improve because the team had improved? Was it because they did a better job of copying more competent games at the time? A little bit of both. Kensei would be Konami's last 3D fighting game for around a decade. Other fighting games from the company did appear. This was more in collaboration with Hudson Soft. In 2003, Konami published Hudson Soft's Dream Mix TV World Fighters, which, for all intents and purposes, is a Smash Bros. Clone. In 2008, there was Castlevania Judgment, which had its own share of controversy beyond the combat. But since then, and the odd 2D fighter before, Konami's not internally developed a 3D fighting game since. I mean, for a long time they weren't developing anything beyond pachinko machines, but most people are aware of those dark times. Now, with the recent reception of Silent Hill 2 Remake and the upcoming MGS3 Remake, it seems Konami is combing through their back catalogue and handing off IPs to other studios to remake or reinterpret. Should Kensei be resurrected like Heihachi Mishima? Nah, let it rest. It's by no means a terrible game, but when judged alongside its contemporaries at the time, it fails to reach the heights of some of the most influential 3D fighting games released in that decade. But hey, if you're looking for a Steven Seagal punching simulator, you won't find a better game than Kensei Sacred Fist.